Hi, I'm Lars, and this is my land. In my land, I get to do pretty much whatever I want, and today I'm going to talk about the fascinating history of Beatles drumming, and you're going to listen, because it's my land. When we think of the Fab Four, or at least when I thought of the Fab Four before I started getting into the Beatles, I just thought of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. I never thought of anybody else. It was always just them. But when you get to know a little bit more about the Beatles, you know that the Beatles drumline has changed quite a bit over the years. Welcome to Annoying Memos Land. Beepity beep beepity beep. My last video was on Beatlemania, and so many people came and commented and told their stories of how they fell in love with the Beatles, and it was so sweet. And I just wanted to say, everyone who came and commented, if you happen to be watching this, thank you so much. I love hearing all of it. If you're one of the people who recommended me books, stick around to the end of this video. I'm going to talk about it. I've been working on a video essay series on the TV show Lost now for so long that if I don't mention it in every single video I do, I will explode into mist like that whale they bombed on that beach that one time. I would absolutely love it if you... I've got a cat in the way. Yep, cool. I would absolutely love it if you'd like and subscribe. And I have the loudest chair in the universe, the driest eyes in the country, but look at them being so good right now. And that TV back there just likes to tilt in odd directions. I don't know what you want me to say. Let's go back to Lars Land. Before the Beatles, there were the Quarrymen. That was John Lennon's group. Paul joined, then later George joined, and they had several players. They had bass, drums, piano, just kind of whatever they can have. Colin Hanton played the drums, but eventually he left. Why did Colin Hanton leave Quarrymen? My cat is going absolutely insane over there. I would show you, but it's not in Lars Land, it's over there. This is page 85 from the Paul McCartney The Life book by Philip Norman. I want to just say real quick that I have reservations about him as a biographer and an author and a journalist, okay? So I'm going to read stuff from this book, but I want everyone to know that I have reservations. Please keep that in mind. So I found it. It actually says, looks like there was so much free beer that even Paul ended up almost incapable of performing. During the hungover, recriminatory homeward journey, something was said that upset their drummer, Colin Hanton, who disembarked with his kit one stop too early and never turned around for another gig. After that, the Beatles were kind of going through a little bit of an identity crisis, trying to find drummers. So they would play where they could when they could find a drummer, and they kept trying to find gigs but couldn't. John and Paul would tell people the rhythm is in the guitars. So they would try to create their rhythm section with the guitars, which I find fascinating because everyone talks about how John Lennon is a great rhythm guitarist, and I don't know a lot about music, but I know that I love the Beatles, and I think that he's just awesome. No shit. The Beatles began playing at the Casbah, who was run by Mona Best, and it turns out that Mona Best's son, Pete, has a drum kit. During the time that the Quarrymen had a 2-month residency at the Casbah, they became friends with Pete. They found out about that drum kit eventually when they got offered a trip to Hamburg to play. They auditioned Pete. He was good enough to keep a rhythm, according to what John Lennon said, and they took off. Here's the problem with going to Hamburg with Pete Best. First off, going to Hamburg, staying in the Reeperbahn, the naughtiest place on earth, according to George.
I was right in the middle of the naughtiest city in the world. At 17 years old, it was kind of exciting.
They're gonna go pretty hard. Our guys got into the prellies, they were doing lots of drugs, they were having lots of sex, they were being pretty punk rock. It turns out that Pete, he just wasn't the party type. He coughed too loud in the smoke circle. He passed out with his shoes on. Dude could not hang. And that's not even to mention the fact that he sucked at drums. Now, I hate saying this because, and I talked about it in another video, but I feel bad because I learned more about Pete Best after I first talked about it. And I was like, let's do a blue meanie alert, I'm being mean. And I guess I still am being mean here. But he wound up making an attempt on his life, I think in the late 60s, and he'd been really depressed after the Beatles ditched him. So I feel bad, but I'm not going to play any Beatles music, any Pete Best music, because I don't want to end up on a list. I feel like there's a different list for that. Like, you can't do that. If you go listen to it, you'll see what I mean. It's pretty bad, okay? He couldn't hang with music, and he could not hang in that smoke circle, baby. He was always coughing too hard. When Pete couldn't make it, when he was sick, or whenever he didn't show up, they asked Ringo to start playing for them. They already knew Ringo. They were playing the same clubs in Hamburg. They were seeing each other play. They started becoming friends with Rory Storm. Storm and the Hurricanes. I'm sure everybody already knows that that was the band that Ringo was playing for. And actually in this book, somewhere in here, I'm not going to look for it right now, they mentioned that Ringo was kind of like the front man in Rory Storm, where he was like out front making a lot of splash. And so when he got to join the Beatles and be in the back and just beat the rhythm, he was like really into it, which I really love. Isn't that awesome? I had no idea about that. That's why I love reading these books. I was like, damn, that's cool. I'm actually going to read a few things about the Pete Best situation from this book, Ringo with a Little Help, by Michael Starr. They are not related. If you didn't know that Starr is not Ringo's last name. Ringo's talking about the Beatles here, and he says, I loved the band so much, and I liked the boys as well as the music, and I thought I had done everything our band could do at the time. We were just repeating ourselves. So Ringo decided to leave the Hurricanes, and he joined guitarist Tony Sheridan's band in Hamburg. He says that the Beatles were the only band that he would go see in Liverpool. This book says that Colin Hanton departed after nearly getting into a fist fight with Paul, who had criticized his timekeeping skills after a sloppy Quarrymen performance magnified by large consumptions of alcohol. See, it's hard to know, right? Like, okay. Anyway, it says in here that it wasn't so much Pete's inability behind the drum set, but his personality. Paul says, Pete had never been quite like the rest of us. We were the wacky trio, and Pete was perhaps a little bit more sensible. He was slightly different from us. He wasn't quite as artsy as we were, and we just didn't hang out that much together. Once George Martin and Brian Epstein worked together to take a chance on the Beatles, GM was not happy with Pete. He was like, really? Martin was not happy with Pete's drumming, and he wasn't shy in sharing his opinion with Brian Epstein. Martin suggested to Epstein that while Pete might continue to play live gigs, he would need to be replaced in studio if the Beatles were going to be considered serious recording artists. Martin felt that the Beatles needed a better backbeat than Best could provide, and besides, no one needed to know who was playing on the studio recordings. Martin wanted to bring in a hot drummer, and Epstein agreed. It was quite a blow, McCartney recalled. Can you change your drummer? And we said, well, we're quite happy with him. He works great in the clubs. And George said, yes, but for recordings, he's got to be a little bit more accurate. Some people say that Paul was just really jealous of Pete because he was supposed to be the best looking Beatle. So John said that McCartney and Best didn't hang out much. It was only partly because Pete was a bit slow. John didn't care about getting rid of Pete. Paul probably wants to look really innocent in this situation. I'm sure he also didn't care. I'm sure he was probably all for it. But in this book, we hear about George. George went to Ringo's house on Admiral Grove. Ringo wasn't there, so George had a cup of tea with Elsie, telling her the Beatles wanted Ringo as their drummer. Ringo, Elsie told him, was at Butlin's with Rory and the Hurricanes, but promised she would have Ringo call George. Everything was good with Rory and the Hurricanes, so all that Rory wanted back was Ringo's pink suit, which I think is really sweet. Brian was tasked with dumping Pete. He went and said, the boys want you out, and Pete was devastated. Ringo never really felt sorry for him. I think, what did he say? Never felt sorry for the man he so unceremoniously replaced since he was a better drummer. Here is a Pete Best quote. I wouldn't rate Ringo as a better drummer than me. I'm adamant about that. And when it happened, I felt like putting a stone around my neck and jumping off the pier head. Here's a quote from Tony Sheridan. Pete was a crap drummer. You can take my word for it. He was just not competent. There were discrepancies between his feet and his hands. And I gotta tell you, man, if you're gonna be a drummer, there can't be discrepancies. Not between your feet and your hands, not between nothing. It sounds awful, and I'm sure that he felt absolutely betrayed. And I know that Neil Aspinall, who was a close friend of Pete, was pretty unhappy. There are some inconsistent sourcing. Some people say that he threatened to quit. Some people say that he didn't. In this book, it says that he wouldn't set up Ringo's drum kit for a few months, but eventually got over it. I don't know, so I'm going to have to look a little bit more into that. I didn't have time to before this. I just brought it up right now, so I didn't actually look it up. But he did get royalty checks, and I think he still does. I'll put it on the screen. So at least there is some of that financial compensation. One thing we all know about Ringo is that he is there. Everybody says it. He doesn't change tempo. They didn't have click tracks back when the Beatles were performing live, but they didn't need them anyway. Paul always talks about that, and I think the other Beatles may have too. What is the quote where it's like John is the heart, Paul is the soul, George is the whatever, and Ringo's the drummer? When Paul talks about the first time that Ringo played with the Beatles, he said that it was like a really wow moment.
Bang, he kicks in and it's like, and it was an oh my God moment. We're like, I remember looking and we're all looking at each other like, yeah, this is it. Whew. I'm getting very emotional.
George was never shy about talking about how much he loved Ringo and how much he loved Ringo's ability to drum. Something that I really liked that I read somewhere in here, in this one, the Daily book. Ringo filled out a survey. They all filled out a survey. And one thing that he said that he hated was drum solos. He was like, the worst thing you can do is drum solos. And he really wasn't big on drum fills, but he was consistent. When I started listening to the Beatles, I kept hearing people say, you can tell when it's Ringo. And I don't know much about music. I keep saying this and I really don't, but I know what they're talking about now and I can hear it. Holy shit, you can tell when it's Ringo. If there are any musicians or smart people listening, if you want to maybe explain some of that in the comments, I would super love to hear what that is. Back to the point, okay? Ringo was playing in Pete Best's stead during absences for a while, but he formally joined in August 1962. Let's clear the air. Let's talk about it. We've all heard it. The question was, is Ringo the best drummer in the world? And the answer was, Ringo isn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. That's horrible, right? I mean, John was never known for being nice, but he never said that. What? Oh my God, no way. I have seen it. I felt like I had seen it too. So I started looking for it. I was like, where is it? Because I needed it for this video and I couldn't find it. I looked everywhere. I even checked under this table. What the hell is Beatles Anthology on VHS doing down here? So I wound up having to look it up, and here's what Mark Lewison, a trusted Beatles author/scholar, said about it. The London Times newspaper quoted John Lennon famously saying that Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. John Lennon never said that, famously or otherwise, and that is the London Times quoting him. For me, it's, when did he say this? I've heard every John Lennon interview. I've read every John Lennon interview. I never saw that quote. So when did he say it, let alone when did he famously say it, he said. I determined to get to the bottom of it, and it's actually a TV comedian's joke from 3 years after John was killed in 1983 by Jasper Carrott. So John Lennon never said it and wouldn't have said it. And I agree with that. I don't think John would have said that. John loved Ringo. He had Ringo play on tons of his stuff. And I mean, all of them loved Ringo. We all know that Ringo, even in spite of the lawsuits and the sleeping with his wives, he can forgive all of the Beatles and wanted to see all three. He wanted to see all three. I love that song. So the idea that any of the Beatles really saying that much shit about Ringo, just, it doesn't come off right because everybody loves Ringo. In order to talk about the fascinating history of the Beatles drumming, we have to talk about Bernard Purdie, who is a very influential drummer. He is incredibly influential in the history of R&B. He came up with the Purdie Shuffle. He played with Aretha Franklin, James Brown, so many freaking just absolutely monumental songs. Real quick, I have a rule about not watching videos on things that I cover. So I don't watch Beatle videos by creators. I only watch interviews, compilations of interviews, things like that. However, this video called Replacing Ringo by the Fab Four Archivist actually blessed my timeline like a year ago or something. It was before my Beatlemania, so I already knew this. So I have to say that I actually learned quite a bit from this video, and I absolutely recommend watching it. This guy is way more ballsy than me, and he has examples, so I think it would be worthy of watching if you want to know more about it. Purdie comes out and claims that he played on 21 Beatles songs. He also says that there were 4 Beatles drummers and that Ringo wasn't one of them.
There are 4 drummers on the Beatles music. Ringo is not one of them.
I just want to talk. Where is he? I'm kidding. I'm not going to go beat up an old man. Is he still alive? Like I could beat up anybody. Are you kidding? He claimed that he played on 21 Beatles songs. He couldn't tell you which ones though. He also claimed that he played on Yeah, 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 which would be She Loves You, but he never named it. But mostly he was claiming playing on Love Me Do. Now in the Fab Four Archivist video, he explains exactly which songs he played on. None of them were our Beatles songs.
Did Purdie replace Ringo's drumming? No. Were there 21 Beatles songs that he worked on? Very doubtful. Was one of them She Loves You or any other Beatles hit? Definitely not. We don't even need to go there.
We can't deny his influence. Of course not, and would never. However, he claims over and over and over again that he played on the Beatles records. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, he didn't. There was no real proof. Later on, he came out with a book and he even says that he doesn't know which drummer he was playing over. So he could have been playing over Pete or he could have been playing over Ringo. And according to Max Weinberg's book, The Big Beat, this is what Ringo Ringo said about the accusations that Bernard Purdie played over his drumming. Well then, what was I doing in the studio? I've heard that rubbish before, everyone expecting me to come out and fight it. You don't bother fighting that shit. God, I love it. Now, we've got to talk about Jimmy Nicol. Ringo, our boy, he has some health problems. On June 3rd, 1964, Ringo had tonsillitis so badly that he had to be hospitalized. This was right before the Australasian tour of 1964, and the Beatles were desperate for a drummer. George Martin suggested that they go with Jimmy Nicol, who is a London drummer that he had just worked with, and he was like, the guy's great, let's go with him. Paul and John reportedly were fine with it. They were like, that's fine, we don't have a choice, let's do this. Now, according to the Beatles anthology, George was not so thrilled. George Harrison threatened to pull out of the tour, telling Epstein and Martin, if Ringo's not going, then neither am I. You can find 2 replacements. This is what George Martin said. They nearly didn't do the Australia tour. George is a very loyal person. It took all of Brian's and my persuasion to tell George that if he didn't do it, he was letting everybody down. And then here's what Ringo said, which let's get our tissues out, okay? It was very strange them going off without me. They'd taken Jimmy Nicol and I thought they didn't love me anymore. All that stuff went through my head. Ow! Jesus, that makes me so sad. Ringo always talks about being the sensitive one, being the emotional one, and I just think of him being sick and just thinking, they're even taking my suit. Jimmy Nicol, they didn't have time, so they had a day. This is what happened. Ringo went into the hospital. George Martin says, I just worked with this guy, Jimmy. Let's give him a call. They call him. He goes and he auditions for the boys. They're like, green light, let's go. Then he packs up his shit, and within 27 hours of that phone call, he is playing his first Beatles gig. They gave him Ringo's suit. Ringo, by the way, is 5'6". I don't know how tall Jimmy Nicol is, but Jimmy Nicol height? Can't find it. I'll put in one of the Australia interviews right here. His sleeve is right here. And he only played with them for 13 days. And he had, I think, 8 shows. Yeah. And this is what Jimmy Nicol said in 1987. After the headlines died, I began dying too. After the money ran low, I thought of cashing in some way or another, but the timing wasn't right and I didn't want to step on the Beatles' toes. They had been damn good for me and to me. But of course, 13 days later, Ringo hopped right back on and our Fab Four was reunited. Now back to Ringo, I do want to mention that Paul took over some of the drumming bits in some of his songs, and sometimes other people played other types of percussion, but Paul's perfectionism is a totally different video, so we're gonna just talk about that later. Just let it go. Some would say, let it be. See you later. We all love Ringo. I found this video not hard to find of all these famous drummers talking about how iconic Ringo is, and I absolutely recommend watching it. And Ringo deserves the recognition, don't you think? I think he absolutely deserves the recognition. But if you don't agree with me, let's listen to what our Beatles had to say about him. Now, John's quote I think is just absolutely beautiful. I don't know what he would have ended up as, but whatever that spark is in Ringo that we all know but can't put our finger on, whether it is acting, drumming, or singing, I don't know. There is something in him that is projectable and would have surfaced with or without the Beatles. Ringo is a damn good drummer. He's not technically good, but I think Ringo's drumming is underrated the same way that Paul's bass playing is underrated. I think that Paul and Ringo stand up with any of the rock musicians. Chill out about he's not technically good. I think Ringo knows that too. He talks about how he can't go around the drum set because he plays left on a right kit. We all know it, right? It's even in here. He wasn't the most accurate. Got better over the years, just as anything with practice gets, but he's not super technical, but he's the best. I apparently can't go a video without talking about Get Back. I think it probably is a good indicator of how Ringo is, where he would just sit at his kit and whatever they were playing, he would just pick it up and he would just add in his fills. Also, Paul and George and John have all mentioned that Ringo's drumming was intuitive, and a lot of the songs were put together with just Ringo intuiting the beat. I mean, how fucking cool is that? There are so many George quotes on Ringo that I really love that are so sweet, but right now, my favorite is when he talks about how Ringo was the member of the band.
It was almost like we were waiting to get going and we couldn't go until all the Beatles were in the frame. Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene.
Paul has said all kinds of stuff with Ringo. He was always there.
It just is something so special. See a lot of these bands when they're playing, they're looking around at the drummer like, you know, is he gonna speed up? Is he gonna slow down? You don't have to look with Ringo. It's just he's there
And I know that that is just a simple quote, but I think that's how I see Ringo. And I think maybe a lot of you guys see him that way. You'll have to let me know. You can count on Ringo. He is the backbone of the Beatles. So while the Beatles had a really fascinating history in drumming, we all know it was Ringo the whole time. But seriously, wasn't this wild? I'm really glad that I got to talk about it. Welcome to Books Land, Library Land. Yeah, welcome to Library Land. So it was recently my birthday. Happy birthday to you. And I got a ton of shit, and I haven't had a chance to read like any of these. I've started on them, but it was just like a week ago. I got the Beatles Tune In extended version. This is book 1. Someone in the comments has told me over and over to get the Bob Spitz book. It is coming, okay? So don't get mad. It's not here yet, but it's on its way. So here are some of the newer ones that I haven't talked about before. I haven't started this yet, but this is George Harrison, Behind the Locked Door. And I think that this is one of the only George books that I've been told that I needed to read. I also got the Jeff Emmerich Here, There, and Everywhere book, which I'm really excited to read. I just got this one and just picked it up last night, so it's really fun. This is the Derek Taylor book, As Time Goes By. And of course, this was the one that everyone has told me to read, and I'm so excited. This is The Beatles and the Historians, and I tell you that this is changing already how I am looking at my Beatles research. I got this on Amazon, but I highly suggest you get it if you are into reading about the Beatles like I am. I'm only 37 pages in, but I was taking a lot of notes. I've been reading it very intentionally. I love that people come to Larsland and comment and tell me what kind of books I should check out and any other sort of information that you think I should know. I absolutely love it. Do not stop. I will be here adding you to my list, okay? So give it to me. I would absolutely love it if you'd like and subscribe and all that jazz. Thank you so much for visiting Larsland, and y'all come back now, you hear? Bye!
My sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord, my sweet Lord.